Chequamegon Bay, Wisconsin, September 1891. The air carried the first clean bite of autumn, a promise that the great cold engine of Lake Superior was beginning to stir. Along the shoreline where timber camps fed the hungry sawmills, men were chinking cabins, stacking cords of hardwood, and preparing for the inevitable siege of winter, all except one. Viggo Lindmark was painting his cabin black, not with paint, which was a luxury few could afford, but with something far stranger. He worked slowly, methodically, with a wide brush made of hog bristles bound to a stick. He'd dip it into a steaming iron kettle of what looked like boiling darkness, a thick, acrid substance that smelled of pine forests and fire. With each stroke, the raw, pale logs of his small cabin disappeared under a glossy, impenetrable coat of black. The other men from the mill, walking the path back to their own cabins, would stop and stare. Their own homes were monuments to honest wood, the pale yellow of fresh-cut pine and the earthy brown of oak. Viggo's was becoming a strange, dark blot against the landscape. Harlan Jessup, the sawmill foreman, was the first to give the confusion a voice. He was a practical man, a man who understood board feet and blade tension better than he understood his own children. He saw Viggo's work not as eccentric, but as a dangerous violation of common sense. "Lindmark," Jessup called out, his voice sharp with authority. He stopped 20 feet away, as if the black cabin might be contagious. A few other men, Silas Croft and Jedediah Crane among them, paused behind him. "What in God's name are you doing to that house?" Viggo paused, brush dripping blackness back into the kettle. He turned. He was a quiet man, with pale eyes that seemed to hold the memory of a different kind of forest. "I am making it weatherproof, Mr. Jessup." Jessup laughed, a short barking sound. "Weatherproof? You're coating it in pitch, man. That's not a house, that's a torch waiting for a spark. One stray ember from that chimney, and your family will be homeless before the first snow. It's the most foolish thing I've ever seen." Silas Croft, a lanky logger with a perpetual squint, nodded in agreement. "He's right, Viggo. It's plain crazy. That thing will go up like a pine knot." Viggo looked at his black wall, then back at the foreman. He offered no argument, no defense. He simply said, "The wood will be dry." Then he turned back to his work, dipping his brush and laying another slow, careful stroke of black tar over the pale wood. The men watched for another moment, shaking their heads. "A fool and his family are soon parted from their roof," Crane muttered to Jessup, who just grunted and led the men away. The mockery lasted for the rest of the afternoon, a low current of jokes and warnings that followed Viggo every time he went to the well or the woodpile. They called it the Swede's coffin and Lindmark's folly. But as the sun set, casting long shadows that merged with the cabin's black walls, a question hung in the cooling air, unspoken but potent. What did this Swedish tar burner, this quiet outsider, understand about the physics of survival that a sawmill foreman and a generation of experienced Wisconsin woodsmen had missed? The answer to that question wouldn't be found in arguments or explanations. It would be delivered by the brutal, honest judge of all frontier innovation, the deep, relentless cold of a Great Lakes winter. I promise you, if you stay with me, you will understand the profound and simple science that Viggo Lindmark was putting to work, a principle that modern building science has only recently rediscovered. We explore stories like this to uncover the lost wisdom of the past. So, if you appreciate this kind of deep dive into history and ingenuity, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. And tell me in the comments, what's the most counterintuitive piece of practical advice you've ever received? Viggo Lindmark was not a carpenter. He had not been a farmer in the old country, nor a logger. In Sweden, he had been a chairbrennare, a tar burner. It was a trade as ancient as the Viking longships, a skill passed down through generations who lived and died by the pine forests of Smoland. He was a man who understood trees not for their timber, but for their blood. His work had not involved the clean geometry of saws and planes. It involved the smoky primal alchemy of the tar kiln. He knew the precise way to stack split pine stumps, rich with resin, into a conical mound. He knew how to cover it with earth and turf, leaving a small flue at the top and a drain at the bottom. He knew the slow, patient burn, a smoldering that lasted for days, not to consume the wood, but to render its essence. His hands were accustomed to the feel of iron cauldrons, the sticky residue of raw resin, the precise, smoky scent that signaled the tar was ready. He didn't build with wood, he sealed it. He made it impervious to the sea, to the rain, to the rot that was the enemy of all things made by man. When he arrived in Wisconsin with his wife Elin and their two small children, Anders and Sophia, he had built a cabin just like everyone else. He had followed the local wisdom, felling the trees, hewing the logs, and chinking the gaps with a mixture of clay and moss. It looked solid. It felt like a fortress. Then came their first winter. It was a brutal education. The problem wasn't the wind, though it howled. It wasn't the snow, though it piled in drifts higher than the windows. The problem was the wet. Chequamegon Bay breathed moisture. The air was heavy with water from the vast, unfrozen heart of Lake Superior, and the logs of their new home drank it in like a thirsty animal. The nightmare began in late November. The walls began to feel damp to the touch. A fine, cold sweat beaded on the interior logs. The chinking, which had been baked hard by the autumn sun, softened, turning back into a cold, gritty mud that oozed from the seams. Elin would wipe down the walls each morning, and by noon, the weeping would have returned. A piece of paper left on the table would feel limp and heavy by morning. The bread in the box molded in 2 days. A constant seeping chill filled the cabin, a dampness that clung to their clothes, their bedding, their very bones. It was a cold that fire couldn't defeat. Viggo burned wood relentlessly. He kept the stove glowing red, but the heat seemed to vanish into the walls. The children, Anders and Sophia, slept in their coats, huddled together. Elin developed a cough that would not leave. Viggo watched them, his heart a cold knot in his chest. He was failing them. The traditional methods, the methods everyone swore by, were failing. One night during a rare thaw, water literally dripped from the ceiling logs. He watched a drop fall and sizzle on the hot stove. In that moment, he understood. The problem wasn't the chinking. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem was the wood itself. His fortress was a sponge, and a wet sponge could never hold warmth. He thought of the long ships of his homeland, their hulls coated in the black pitch of his trade, sailing through icy seas, their wooden frames dry and sound. He looked at his weeping walls and knew what he had to do. The failure of a standard log cabin in the humid climate of the upper Great Lakes was a slow, creeping disaster rooted in basic physics. The frontiersmen who built them were skilled craftsmen, but they were fighting an invisible enemy they did not fully comprehend: water vapor. A log is not a solid, inert block. It is a bundle of millions of microscopic hollow tubes, called tracheids, that once carried water from the tree's roots to its leaves. When the wood is dry, these tubes are filled with air. Air is a phenomenal insulator. It's the principle behind a wool blanket or a bird's feathers. The trapped pockets of still air resist the transfer of heat. A dry log wall, with its countless air-filled cells, is a reasonably effective barrier against the cold. But in the damp air of a place like Chequamegon Bay, this structure becomes a liability. The wood acts like a wick. Through a process called hygroscopic absorption, the cellulose fibers of the wood pull moisture directly from the air. The water vapor infiltrates the log, condensing into liquid water and filling those microscopic, insulating air pockets. The thermal conductivity of water is about 25 times higher than that of still air. When the air in the wood cells is replaced by water, the log's insulating value plummets. A log with a moisture content of 25%, common in that environment, conducts heat nearly 4 times faster than a log with a moisture content of 5%. This created a vicious cycle. As the warm, moist air from inside the cabin, from breathing, cooking, and boiling water, hit the cold interior surface of the logs, it would condense, adding even more moisture to the wood. The wetter the logs became, the colder their interior surface got, which in turn caused even more condensation. The walls were actively pulling the heat out of the cabin. The families inside were effectively living within a giant frozen radiator. The men at the sawmill knew the result, if not the cause. They saw their firewood consumption skyrocket. A cabin that needed 3 cords of wood to survive a winter in a drier climate might burn through 7 or 8 here. They saw the constant battle against frost, which would form a thick, white crust on the inside of the walls, inches from where their children slept. They accepted it as the price of living in the North Woods. They fought it with bigger fires and thicker blankets, treating the symptom because they did not understand the disease. The disease was water. In the late summer, as others were hunting or fishing, Viggo Lindmark returned to the trade of his ancestors. He spent weeks in the cutover lands, harvesting the one thing the loggers left behind, pine stumps. He looked for old-growth white pine, stumps grayed with age, their hearts saturated with the rich orange resin that the tree produces to heal its wounds. He hauled them back to his property on a small handcart, his muscles straining with the unfamiliar labor. He didn't build a large, traditional Swedish tar kiln. He didn't have the time or the resources. Instead, he improvised, creating a small, efficient kiln from field stone and clay, lining a pit in the earth. He stacked the resin-heavy wood inside, covered it, and lit the slow, smoldering fire. For 3 days, a thin plume of pungent, aromatic smoke rose from the mound. Elin and the children grew used to the smell, a scent that was both acrid and deeply organic, the smell of the forest giving up its ghost. From a pipe at the bottom of the kiln, a thick, black liquid slowly oozed into an iron basin. It was pine tar, the raw, unrefined lifeblood of the wood. He collected gallons of it. He then heated the tar in a large kettle over an open fire, carefully boiling off the excess water and turpentine until it reached the perfect consistency, thick but spreadable, a substance that would cool into a tough, flexible, and utterly waterproof skin. This was the process that Harlan Jessup and the others had witnessed, the slow, deliberate act of mummifying his own home. He started with the north wall, the one that bore the brunt of the winter wind. He worked the hot pitch into every crack, every check, every knot in the wood. He sealed the seams where the logs met, forcing the black liquid deep into the gaps before smoothing it over the surface. The pale pine disappeared, log by log, under the dark, glossy coat. It was during this phase that Jessup made his most pointed critique. He strode up to Viggo's property line, his face a mask of genuine concern mixed with exasperation. "Lindmark, I'm telling you, as the man who runs the mill that supplies this camp, you're creating a hazard. We have rules about fire safety for a reason. All it takes is one good wind to blow an ember from your chimney onto that roof, and that pitch will ignite. It'll run down the walls in rivers of fire. You have a wife and children in there. For their sake, stop this madness." Jessup's criticism was specific, technical, and delivered with the confident authority of a man in charge. He was pointing out a real, tangible risk. Vigo wiped a smear of pitch from his knuckle with a turpentine-soaked rag. He looked at Jessup, then at his work. His response was, as always, minimal. "Pitch on a ship's hull does not catch fire from the galley stove, Mr. Jessup," he said quietly. "The fire is inside. The protection is outside." He then turned back to his wall, leaving the foreman sputtering, unable to argue with a logic so alien to his own experience. Vigo wasn't defensive. He was simply operating from a different set of principles. The mockery from the other men continued, but it was now tinged with a grudging respect for his sheer stubbornness. He was a fool, they agreed, but a determined one. The science behind Vigo's black cabin was an elegant solution to the problem of thermal conductivity. To understand why it worked so well, one has to think about heat not as a feeling, but as energy in motion. Heat energy always moves from a warmer area to a colder one, and it travels via three methods: conduction, convection, and radiation. For a log cabin, the primary enemy is conduction, the direct transfer of heat through the solid material of the walls. The effectiveness of an insulator is measured by its resistance to this flow, its R value. A material with a high R value is a poor conductor of heat, which makes it a good insulator. As we've established, dry wood, filled with tiny pockets of trapped air, has a decent R value. A standard 6-inch pine log might have an R value of about 8. But when those air pockets fill with water, the physics changes dramatically. The R value of water is abysmal, close to 0. The water creates thousands of tiny thermal bridges, microscopic highways, for heat to escape the cabin. The R value of a wet 6-inch log can drop to as low as 2. In practical terms, this means a person would have to burn 4 times as much wood to maintain the same interior temperature. They are not just heating the air in the cabin, they are spending most of their energy heating the water trapped inside their walls, which then efficiently transfers that heat to the outside world. A standard cabin in Chequamegon Bay was an incredibly inefficient heat engine, running in reverse. Vigo's pine pitch seal was not an insulator itself. In fact, the pitch had a lower R value than dry wood, but that wasn't its function. Its function was to be a perfect barrier to moisture. It was hydrophobic. The long-chain molecules of the resin repelled water at a chemical level. It was applied hot, allowing it to penetrate the outer layer of the wood and fill the surface pores, creating an impermeable membrane. This membrane did one simple, crucial thing. It kept the logs dry. Rain, sleet, and melting snow could not soak into the wood from the outside. More importantly, it prevented the hygroscopic absorption of moisture from the humid air. The millions of tiny air pockets within the logs remained filled with insulating air, not heat-sapping water. Vigo had preserved the wood's natural R value. His walls, despite being just 6 inches thick, would perform as if they were in a dry Montana valley, not on the saturated shores of Lake Superior. Harlan Jessup's concern about fire was logical, but misplaced. While freshly applied liquid pitch is flammable, once cured, it forms a stable, solid layer. It would burn if exposed to a direct, sustained flame, but it was not volatile. An ember landing on it would be more likely to smolder and die than to ignite the entire structure, much like an asphalt shingle. Vigo understood that the true danger wasn't a hypothetical fire from a stray spark, but the certain, grinding theft of heat by the water in the walls, a danger that claimed lives every single winter. That November, the lake began its assault. The winter arrived not as a single decisive blow, but as a series of punishing skirmishes. It was a classic lake effect season, driven by the temperature differential between the cold Arctic air and the relatively warm, open water of Lake Superior. For 14 straight days, the region was caught in a brutal freeze-thaw cycle. During the day, the temperature would climb just above freezing, to 33 or 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun, weak as it was, would melt the surface of the snow. The air would be thick with moisture, a clinging, damp cold. At night, the temperature would plummet into the single digits. Everything that had melted would freeze solid. For the standard log cabins in the settlement, this cycle was devastating. During the day, their porous log walls soaked up the meltwater and the airborne humidity. At night, this absorbed water would freeze, expanding and forcing the wood fibers apart. With each passing day, the cabins became more saturated. From a distance, the effect was grimly picturesque. Every cabin, including Harlan Jessup's own well-built home, became sheathed in a thick armor of ice. The heat leaking through the wet logs would melt the snow on the roof and the frost on the walls, which would then run down and freeze, creating a crust of ice that grew thicker with every cycle. The men joked about it, calling their homes ice palaces, but the reality was dire. Inside those cabins, the fight for warmth was a losing battle. Stoves ran day and night, consuming vast quantities of precious hardwood. Yet the air remained cold and clammy. Frost coated the nail heads on the interior walls, perfect white circles where the cold was conducted straight through the wood. The dampness was relentless. Bedding never felt truly dry. Leather boots grew stiff with mold. The constant draining cold frayed nerves and weakened bodies. But one cabin looked different. Viggo Lindmark's cabin remained starkly black against the white landscape. There was no sheath of ice on its walls. The snow that landed on its roof would melt from the gentle warmth escaping the chimney and run off. But the walls themselves remained bare and dry. The black surface, absorbing the faint winter sun, would often be free of snow entirely, while the ground around it was covered. It looked strange, alien, but it did not look cold. Inside, a different reality was unfolding. Viggo burned a fraction of the wood his neighbors did. A small, steady fire in the stove was enough to keep the single room comfortably warm. The air was dry. Ellen's cough had vanished. The children, Anders and Sophia, could play on the floor in their woolen socks, not their heavy coats. The domestic warmth was proven by a small, mundane detail. Pinned to the wall near the table was a page from the Ashland Weekly Press, put there to cover a drafty seam Viggo had missed in the chinking. All winter it remained perfectly flat, its edges crisp, its paper dry to the touch. It was a simple, impossible fact in a world of damp and decay. The vindication came on the 14th day of the cycle. Harlan Jessup was making his rounds, checking on the welfare of the families in the company cabins. The misery was palpable. He'd just left Silas Croft's place, where the air was thick with smoke and damp, and the children were pale and listless. As he trudged through the deep snow, his gaze fell upon the Lindmark cabin, standing apart, dark and unadorned. The contrast was jarring. Every other structure in sight was glazed with a thick, lumpy coating of ice. Viggo's cabin was just black wood. No frost, no ice, nothing. It seemed to defy the very weather around it. For the first time, a seed of doubt was planted in Jessup's practical mind. He had been so certain, so dismissive, yet the evidence before his eyes was undeniable. One cabin was fighting a losing war with winter. The other seemed to be ignoring it completely. He walked toward it, his boots crunching in the snow. He was the foreman. It was his duty to check on the family, especially the family of the man everyone called a fool. He expected the worst, that the strangeness of the exterior hid some deeper misery within. He knocked on the door. Viggo opened it. A wave of simple, dry warmth washed over Jessup, a stark contrast to the biting, damp air he had been breathing. There was no cloud of condensing vapor, no immediate chill. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. The stove was not roaring. It was burning with a low, steady hiss. The air didn't smell of damp wool and smoke. It smelled faintly of baking bread. Then he saw the children on the floor, building a small tower of wood scraps, their cheeks rosy and healthy. Elin nodded a polite greeting from the table. Jessup's gaze scanned the walls. He was a man of wood. He knew its textures, its colors, its behavior. He expected to see the familiar sheen of condensation, the white blossoms of frost on the logs. He saw nothing, just dark, dry wood. He walked over to the wall, his skepticism warring with the evidence of his senses. He braced himself for the deep, radiating cold he knew so well, the feeling of a wall that was actively stealing your body heat. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against an interior log. The sensation was his conversion. He didn't feel the biting cold of a wet, frozen log. He didn't feel warmth either. He felt nothing. It was the neutral temperature of the room. The wall was not a thermal thief. It was just a wall. All the energy they were expending, all the wood they were burning, was staying in the room. His eyes fell on the newspaper pinned to the wall. In his own office at the mill, the company ledgers curled from the damp. Their pages were soft and wavy. This paper was flat, crisp. He touched its edge. It was as dry as if it had just come off the press. He turned to Viggo, the arrogance and certainty gone from his face, replaced by a deep, resonant awe. He finally understood. Viggo hadn't been building a fire trap. He had been building a fortress of a different kind. "You didn't just chink the gaps, Lindmark," Jessup said, his voice low. The line that would echo through the logging camps for years came to him then, a perfect metaphor born of his own world. "You didn't build a cabin. You built a dry kiln for your family to live in." Viggo simply nodded. The wood must be dry. The story of Jessup's visit to the black cabin spread through the settlement faster than a winter flu. The mockery stopped overnight, replaced by a grudging, then open curiosity. Men who had called Viggo a fool now stopped him on the path, not to joke, but to ask questions. Viggo, in his quiet way, answered them. He explained the principle was not his own, but one as old as the sea. He shared his knowledge freely, never once mentioning the ridicule he had endured. When spring finally broke the grip of the ice, Harlan Jessup proved his conversion was total. He was, above all, a practical man. And the Lindmark cabin represented an astonishing leap in efficiency and safety. He placed an order not for lumber, but for labor. He commissioned Viggo to oversee the production of dozens of barrels of pine pitch. That summer, a new scent mingled with the smell of sawdust at the Chequamegon Bay sawmill, the sharp, clean aroma of rendering pine tar. Under Viggo's guidance, a work crew coated every single one of the company's bunkhouses and supply sheds in the black, protective seal. The cost of the pitch was minimal, little more than the labor required to produce it. The following winter was the true test. The logging camps, once notorious for their drafty, ice-encrusted bunkhouses, were transformed. The loggers reported burning less than half the firewood of previous years. The company's quarterly reports showed a staggering reduction in fuel costs. More importantly, the men were healthier. The persistent coughs and fevers that had plagued the camps each winter were noticeably reduced. The practice spread. Settlers and homesteaders who heard the story began adopting the method. Viggo Lindmark's folly became known as the Wisconsin Seal. By 1895, the sight of a black-coated cabin was no longer a curiosity, but a sign of a well-prepared and knowledgeable owner. Agricultural bulletins and settlers' guides began to include sections on pitching exterior walls for winter survival, citing the dramatic success in the northern timber country. Viggo Lindmark never sought fame or fortune from his innovation. He had simply wanted his family to be warm and dry. In solving his own problem, he had provided a solution for an entire region. The simple wisdom of Viggo Lindmark's black cabin anticipated some of the most fundamental principles of modern building science by nearly a century. What he created with pine pitch and fire is what we now create with polymer wraps and advanced caulking. He had built a primitive but highly effective air and moisture barrier. Today we talk about the building envelope, the physical separation between the conditioned and unconditioned environment of a building. A key component of this is the weather-resistive barrier, a material applied to the exterior sheathing to prevent liquid water from infiltrating the wall assembly. Another is the vapor barrier, which controls the movement of water vapor. Viggo's single layer of pine pitch performed both functions simultaneously. His technique of keeping the structural material, the wood, completely dry is the foundational goal of high-performance construction. We now know that moisture intrusion is the enemy of durability, energy efficiency, and indoor air quality. Viggo's solution was elegant because it used a natural, locally sourced material to solve a complex physics problem. He didn't have the language of R values or vapor diffusion, but he had a deep, intuitive understanding of the principle, passed down through a tradition of Scandinavian boat builders and tar burners. His black cabin was not just a home, it was a perfectly executed scientific experiment. There is a simple, profound truth at the heart of Viggo Lindmark's story, a philosophy captured in the old Swedish wisdom he embodied. What the rain never touches, the cold can never take. This isn't a statement about fighting the elements head-on. It is a much deeper insight about understanding the nature of a threat. The enemy, for the settlers of Chequamegon Bay, was not the cold itself. The cold was merely a condition as inevitable and impersonal as the setting of the sun. The true enemy, the accomplice that gave the cold its power to steal life and warmth, was the water. The other settlers fought the cold directly. They threw more fuel on the fire, piling log after log into their stoves in a desperate brute force battle. They were fighting the symptom. Viggo ignored the symptom and went after the cause. He didn't try to generate more heat. He focused on preserving the heat he had. He did this by denying the cold its pathway into his home. He understood that you don't win a war against the winter by having the biggest fire. You win by building a home that the damp can never claim. It's a lesson that extends far beyond logs and tar. The most resilient systems, whether in engineering or in life, are often not the ones that fight the hardest, but the ones that cleverestly sidestep the battle altogether, creating a space where the threat simply has no purchase. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to the Wisconsin frontier. If you found this story of ingenuity and forgotten wisdom valuable, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing for more content like this. Let us know in the comments what other historical innovations you'd like to see us explore. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.